Okay, I guess I'm still trying to learn this live thing on streaming for YouTube. It's all very confusing. You know, whenever you produce a video by yourself and you have your video editing software and all of this other stuff, you can open up stuff in Premiere and you can throw in all of your great Adobe After Effects stuff and you can produce it. Doing it live, there's a lot of moving parts to doing it live, and it's been, I don't know, I guess about 20 years since I did live radio, and live radio doesn't have a visual element. That was tough enough to keep up with. Now this video streaming live is a little bit more confusing, and there's a lot of other stuff that you have to take into account. I suppose as time goes on, I'll get a little bit better at it and I'll figure this stuff out. I did want to talk about a couple of things this week, some interesting stuff that we heard about a couple of games, and of course Game of Thrones is back this week as well, so that's made everybody very happy to wrap up the whole Game of Thrones thing. But let's start off talking about Call of Duty World War II. Now, this is going to be kind of interesting because it was confirmed this week that if you're in multiplayer mode, it's going to be a little different than campaign mode. First of all, in multiplayer mode, no Nazi insignias, no swastikas, anything like that. That's just going to be a definite no-no in multiplayer mode. Now, my friends on the right will immediately begin screaming about, oh, this is all social justice warrior bullshit, and it's really not. It's more of a monetary thing. You know, there are many places in the world where Nazi heraldry is just illegal to show, including Germany, by the way, where the swastika is banned. So if you really want to have a game that has more universal appeal and that can be sold overseas in many countries where Nazi imagery is illegal, then you have to take it out. So there were some complaints about that this week where people were just saying, well, this is stupid, this whole Nazi thing. That was the way the war was. The Nazis had this stuff. We can't whitewash history. And I don't think it's about whitewashing history. I think it's about having as many people being able to play the multiplayer experience as possible. Something a little more interesting than the removal of Nazi insignias from the multiplayer mode, however, is that it is perfectly possible, if you want, to play Call of Duty World War II as a black woman in the German army. I'm fairly sure that the number of black women in the German army could be counted on no hands. So if you're interested in the immersive aspect of the combat experience that you get out of Call of Duty World War II, that's going to break your immersion a little bit. And again, you're going to get these cries of, oh, well, this is all just SJW posturing and everybody has to be represented in the game. And you know, there has been some criticism of Sledgehammer about this whole thing because whenever they did their reveal this last week, aside of their annoying tendency to talk about it being a boots on the ground experience, a phrase that they repeated, boots on the ground, about 150 times. They were criticized because the three people from Sledgehammer who were on stage unveiling the game were all white males, thus, of course, minimizing the experience of other races and cultures and peoples in the game. Okay, that's taking it a bit too far. But I think it's taking it a bit too far on the right to talk about having black women as German army soldiers is forcing SJW stuff down our throat. Look, the multiplayer mode is just that. It's just a game mode. It kind of happens in a setting of World War II, but it's not World War II. And it is a video game. So I think that we can credit them, A, for making a game experience in the campaign mode that is apparently as historically accurate as they can make it, while lightening up a little bit in the multiplayer mode. Some people want to play as themselves. In fact, a lot of people want to play as themselves. I'm kind of one of those people that if there's a character creator and I can make the main character look like me, I'll do it. I spent God knows how long in Dragon Age Inquisition just a couple of weeks ago, making a brand new character that looked exactly like me, or as exactly like me as I could make it in the character creator. So give people a break. I think all this talk about SJW is BS in Call of Duty World War II is probably taking it a little too far. Something that may not be taking it a little too far, again, when you want to talk about SJW posturing, Mass Effect Andromeda. And I just happened to notice something this week, and we can talk about the game and all the other stuff, all the SJW stuff that BioWare has been involved with, and we can talk about the gameplay and how bad the story is and all the glitches and the horrible facial animation, but that stuff's been done to death. One thing that I noticed this week that just came to my attention was this right here. This is the Nexus. This is the main space station that I call not the Citadel in Mass Effect Andromeda. Now, here's the thing about this. This is this huge space station. How large is it? Well, if you look here in this little tiny circle that I've got on the overlay image, what I've encircled is one of the ARC ships, the Hyperion, docked with the Nexus space station. Now, the Hyperion holds 20,000 people in cold sleep. And now it's docked to the Nexus. And I guess my question is, how did the Nexus get to Andromeda? I mean, it's really big. And I'm just wondering how it traveled 2.5 million light years to the Helios cluster in Andromeda and got to where it is. I have no earthly idea why it's there, I know why it's so huge, but how did you get it there? Did they ship it in pieces? Were there other ARC ships? Because we were told in the game itself that there's 100,000 people there. There's 4 ARC ships with 20,000 people each, and then presumably there's 20,000 people on the Nexus. But the Nexus hasn't even been built yet. It's only half constructed. And throughout the game, you always see people working on the Nexus, trying to build it. And you can see about one half of it is simply just a superstructure. There's nothing else to it. So did they just fly the frame out there? And if they did fly the frame out there, where are they getting all of the materials to make this space station that is 100 times larger than an ARC ship that holds 20,000 people? There's no explanation of it, and it doesn't make a lot of sense. Which, okay, Mass Effect Andromeda doesn't make a lot of sense. Why go to Andromeda anyway? If you know the Mass Effect lore, there's plenty of stuff in the Milky Way galaxy that no one has ever gone to because we didn't have the ability with faster than light travel that we had to go those distances. And yet somehow we have the ability to go 2.5 million light years in 634 years, and that works out just fine. Well, if you can do that, why not go to all of these previously inaccessible places in the Milky Way galaxy? The only way anybody else is going any place is through the mass relays, so the vast majority of the galaxy is completely unexplored. And if you wanted to get away from the Reapers or whatever, why not just travel to one of the other galactic arms in the Milky Way that doesn't have a mass relay and explore that? Why go to Andromeda? And if this is a new kind of star drive that somehow got the Nexus to Andromeda, do you really want to make your first test trip a 634-year test flight with 20,000 people in cold sleep? Doesn't make much sense. But there's a lot about Mass Effect Andromeda that doesn't make a lot of sense, so I guess we'll just have to elide right past that. Game of Thrones came back this week. Yes, Game of Thrones is back. We got to see episode 1, and Daenerys has finally made it back to Dragonstone. A couple of weird things about this episode is, well, I guess it's not weird in that Cersei is a complete lunatic, and so she's become more of a lunatic. Now, her son, her last son, Tommen, who committed suicide, she now says betrayed her. And so she wants to set up a dynasty. And as her brother asked her, a dynasty for who? All of our children are dead. Well, I guess a dynasty for us is her answer. But she's losing it. She doesn't have a lot to pulled together as far as an army goes outside of the Lannister forces. Arya came back, killed basically everyone in the Frey family. So House Frey is dead. Is it House Frey or House Frey? I never can remember that. But anyway, she killed old Walder at the very end of last season, and the very first scene this season, she killed everyone in the Frey household. So little revenge is sweet for her. But there was an interesting scene in that, which I watched with a lot of dread because it's Game of Thrones. So you expect something really dark to happen. And Arya is traveling through the forest. Oh, yeah, by the way, spoilers. If you haven't seen it, too bad. I'm going to talk about it anyway. Arya is traveling through the forest, and she comes across this group of about 5 Lannister soldiers. And they tell her, hey, come sit down. We got a rabbit to eat. Sit down by the fire with us and we'll talk. And she does. And, of course, I expect that these are Lannister soldiers. They're going to do something horrible to her. And as it turns out, they're just, regular guys. They're soldiers. They don't particularly want to be there. By the way, pop star Ed Sheeran is one of the soldiers. Some people said that took them out of the story. But, who in America, Ed Sheeran isn't all that popular. So it didn't take me out. I recognized him, and he sang a little bit of a folk song. But for the most part, he didn't overact or underact. He was just there, so I didn't find a problem with it. And I expected these soldiers to do something horrible to Arya, and they just don't. They have this nice little scene where they're all just sitting around talking whimsically about home, about how they want to go back. And it kind of humanizes the Lannister forces in that, they're not evil in the way that their leaders are. They're just soldiers. They're just doing what they're told, what they've been sworn to do, and they don't like being away from home any more than soldiers in any era have liked being away from home. And so they had this nice scene, even to the point where they asked her, why she was going to go to King's Landing. Arya said, well, I'm going to kill the queen. And there was this drop-dead serious silence for just a brief moment. And then everybody busts out laughing, including Arya, because, the idea of this young girl going all the way to King's Landing just to kill Cersei is outrageous. But of course we know that it probably isn't outrageous. One of the more interesting scenes was the scene between Jon Snow and Arya Stark. They were at a council meeting. I'm sorry, not Arya. Oh no, I can't think of what's her name? The redheaded one. Sansa Stark. So Sansa Stark and Jon Snow has been proclaimed the king in the north now. They're at this council meeting, and Sansa disagrees with him during the council meeting. And after the council meeting, they actually went and talked, and they had a conversation about it, and Sansa came about as close as I suppose she could to saying Jon was right and she was wrong. But, one of the tropes that you always see in TV and movies is these tragic things happen because the characters never talk to each other. And I thought it was really neat that Sansa and Jon actually were able to go and talk to each other, talk about what had just happened, and give their differing viewpoints, and come to, if not agreement, at least peace with each other over it. And there was also an interesting addendum to that scene as Lord Baelish comes up and talks to Sansa, and Lord Baelish, for whatever reason, is just completely enraptured by Sansa. I think he fancies himself through Sansa becoming king in the north. Good luck with that. And Sansa just brushes him off, and she has a great line at the end of it where he is about to say something, and she said, just leave, don't say anything, and I'll assume you said something terribly clever. And she just walked away from him. So she's gone, she's had quite an interesting character arc. She's gone from being this completely naive and innocent little waif to someone who's learned quite a lot from Cersei Lannister. And then finally, there was the return of Daenerys Targaryen to Dragonstone. Now, they arrive at the castle. For some reason, this castle, which is a strategic castle, fairly close apparently to King's Landing, is completely unoccupied. Now, this was the headquarters that Stannis Baratheon had used during his campaign in the War of the Four Different Kings in Season 2. And apparently he left and no one moved in, not even squatters. The whole castle is empty. And one wouldn't think that you would leave a strategic piece of ground like that completely empty and completely unguarded, but apparently it was, and that just didn't make a lot of sense to me. That seemed like a plot hole. There should have been at least a scene where the head of the Unsullied comes up and says, you know, our advance parties have been in and cleared out the squatters. We're ready for you to enter. But it was just, she's the first person on shore. She's the first person through the gate. And she goes into this abandoned castle. And it was supposed to be, I think, a really big emotional scene. And it was very underplayed. And it didn't seem like a big emotional scene. It should have been. You know, the dragons flying around. Something else should have happened. And I'm not sure what. Other than covering the plot hole, but it needed more emotional impact than it had. Here's her ancestral home where she was born, but which she has never seen in her memory, and she's returning to it, and you just don't get a sense that she cares much about it. She walks into the throne room where the Targaryen lord sits, and she walks right past it, goes into the war room, says, "Shall we begin?" And the season opens up. So we're setting up Game of Thrones for what's going to be apparently a lot of battles, and we did see one scene of the real threat. And the interesting thing is something that I noticed, which is everyone is preparing to fight these wars with each other. So you have Cersei, who wants to fight against both Jon Snow in the north, the Starks. She wants to fight against everyone in Highgarden. She has no allies, and she's got all these people she wants to fight against. She may or may not come up with some sort of alliance against Euron, who is sort of the pretender to be king of the Iron Islands. But everybody is trying to fight each other. Daenerys Targaryen is there. She's there to throw the Baratheons out of King's Landing and become the rightful queen of the Targaryen dynasty that she imagines herself to be. The king in the north, Robb Stark, is preparing to... He's the only one, by the way, preparing to defend not only against Cersei Lannister, but against the real threat, which we only saw for about 30 seconds. Which is the Winter King marching south towards the wall with his army of undead. So that's the real enemy. And everyone else is preoccupied, other than Jon Snow, with fighting each other and winning King's Landing. I think it says something very human about this need for power and this need to be in control, that nobody's even really thinking about or concerned about what the actual threat is. If the Winter King wins, it doesn't matter who's sitting on the throne in King's Landing. It's all over. And humans, for some reason, can't seem to get things like that through their thick head. Humans have a bad sense of priority. And everybody but Jon Snow seems to have a bad sense of priority. Even Sansa, when she's having her conversation with Jon, tells him about how dangerous Cersei is, that she will not rest until the Starks are destroyed. That is, of course, perfectly true, but not really relevant to the situation now, which is that basically everybody needs to band together against the Winter King and his undead army. Oh, and then one more thing. There was good old Sam. He's in Old Town learning to be a maester, and learning to be a maester apparently involves serving soup and cleaning out bedpans, which is all he's allowed to do. But he does sneak into the library that he's not supposed to go into, and he does find out that the one thing that he knows kills the White Walkers, presumably including the Winter King, is dragon glass, obsidian. And he learns that there is a mountain of obsidian beneath Dragonstone. And Daenerys Targaryen is just now sitting unopposed in Dragonstone. So that's where we'll leave off, and I guess we'll have to pick that up next week. And I guess I'll have to pick this up again next week as well. That's about all I have for you tonight. Have a great night, everybody. Had fun. I suppose that I'll get a little bit better at this as time goes on and I get the logistics of it down. thanks for watching. It's been enjoyable for me. I hope it's been enjoyable for you. We'll talk to you next time. Till then, so long.